Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and another video. This week I really felt like painting a watercolour portrait, so I thought I'd give you my top 5 tips for watercolour portraits and share my painting process with you. Of course, this is not going to be the only way to paint portraits in watercolour, it's just my way, but I hope you find it useful in some way and enjoy the video. All the materials I'll be using will be listed in the description box, along with a link to the reference photo I'm using from Pixabay, and I'll put this on screen for you to see when I start painting. So with that all said, let's jump straight in with tip number 1, which is to draw an accurate outline sketch. And you can use whatever method for this that suits you best. If you are confident to do so, you can draw it freehand, or if not, you can trace it using a light box, a window, or use the reverse transfer method. Personally, I like to use the grid method and draw my outline on a separate piece of paper first before transferring it to my watercolour paper. I try and keep the outline sketch as light as possible so it's not visible on the finished painting, and I use a kneaded eraser to lift up and lighten my sketch once it's down. I would also highly recommend that you use proper watercolour paper for your portrait, and if you can, use one that is 100% cotton, as it will stand up better to being wet and adding multiple layers of paint than cellulose or wood pulp paper. It doesn't matter which type of surface you use, but I prefer cold press paper as its slightly textured surface dries more slowly than hot press paper, which gives you a bit more time to paint. Next, tip number 2 is to study your reference image before you start painting. I tend to pick out the lightest and darkest areas that I can see within the skin first and see how shadows play across the shape and form of the face, and I try to keep this in mind when I'm painting. If you have the facility to print out a copy of your reference image, or you have a tablet you can draw on, you could also highlight these areas and even add a few light pencil marks to your outline drawing to remind you. There are some really light areas on my reference around the lips and down the right side of the face. There are also brighter areas on the nose, the cheek, and of course the white of the eyes. I also look at the darkest areas, so the hair on the left hand side here for example, and on the neck. And I observe how the colours transition within the reference image and look for hard and soft edges. So does the transition happen gradually from one colour to the next, like within the cheeks and around the highlight areas? Or is there a hard edge, like between the jawline and the neck here? Doing this helps me to familiarise myself with the painting and also gets me thinking about which techniques I'll use on different parts of the face. So for example, whether I use the wet in wet technique or the wet on dry technique. So I've got my outline sketch down and I've studied the reference image. My next tip, tip 3, is to mix out your skin colours before you start and swatch them out on a scrap piece of watercolour paper. This will save valuable time when you're painting. It's also important to make sure you mix up enough of each colour so you don't run out and have to remix halfway through painting. I mix up a light skin tone, a mid skin tone and a dark skin tone to start with, as I'm going to paint the skin first. I use my reference image to guide me again, but you have to bear in mind that the colours will likely look less vibrant on a printout than they do on a screen, and that watercolours tend to dry lighter. I'm using a mixture of cadmium red light and transparent ochre for my lighter skin tone, and a mixture of mauve, cadmium red light and madder brown for my mid-tone. For the darkest skin tone, I'm using burnt sienna and mauve. So I've done all the prep work, I've got all my materials ready, now it's time for the fun bit, the painting, and tip number 4, which is to work in layers from light to dark and build up gradually to the values you need. It's much easier to build up layers gradually than it is to try and lift colour out later on. I start painting the skin using the wet in wet technique, so I pre-wet the skin area with clean water first before adding paint. This way there won't be any hard edges and I can get some nice smooth colour transitions. I leave the eyes free of water at this stage as I want to preserve the white of the paper here and have a bit more control. I'll paint those in later. Some artists paint over the whole area first, including the eyes, but do whatever works best for you. I start off with my lightest colour and paint this all over the wet areas of the face and neck with a large round brush. This one is a size 10. Choosing a larger brush helps me to paint more quickly and give me more time to drop in other colours before the paper starts to dry. I work very loosely to begin with and add in the darker skin tones to the areas that appear darker on my reference photo. So on the left side of the face here that's in shadow, under the lips and eyes, and under the nose. I leave adding in any darker colour to the neck at this stage as I want a nice crisp edge there without paint bleeding out over the chin. I let this layer dry completely before re-wetting it again for the next layer. It's really important to make sure your paper is completely dry before you start re-wetting it for the next layer, because if it's not, the addition of more water or paint will likely disturb the drying paint on the previous layer, and you'll end up with backwash and get watercolour blooms, which you probably don't want if you're aiming for a smooth skin texture. So I work my second layer much the same as the first, building up the various skin tones gradually, and whilst I was waiting for this layer to dry, I painted in the nostrils and began to fill in the lips. For this next layer, I'm applying my paint to dry paper this time. This will allow me to add more concentrated paint and have more control about where it goes. I can still achieve nice soft edges just by running a clean damp brush along the paint edge. I do this around the nose too, so applying paint and softening out the edge. Moving on to the shadow on the right side of the girl's face, and I do the same thing again, using the darkest of the three skin tones I mixed up at the start. It might look too dark now, but it'll dry lighter, and without having any of our darkest values in yet, it's a bit hard to judge. But that's the beauty of being able to work in layers with watercolour. You can keep adding to it and building on it until you're happy with how it looks. However, what I would also say is that this can take time, and during this time your painting can often go through an ugly phase before it all comes together. So my tip number 5 is to be patient and don't give up on your painting too soon. If, like on this portrait, you are working from light to dark, like I said, it can be hard to judge whether your skin tones are accurate without the darkest values in to act as a benchmark. So it was at this stage, with all the wet washes complete, that I decided to start adding in some of those darker shades. For accuracy, I used the wet on dry technique again to add in the darkest details to the nostrils. I also darkened up the neck, carefully painting around the chin first with clean water and then adding paint. I used a smaller size 8 brush here to ensure I didn't add too much water and could control where my water and paint would go. I needed to get a really neat crisp edge here and not paint over the highlight on the chin. I added another layer to the lips too, and at this stage started to think about painting in some of the details I could see on the reference photo, using just the tip of my brush. I wanted to paint the eyes next, which are my favourite part of any painting and really bring a portrait to life. I painted the iris on dry paper and let the darker colour of the pupil bleed into it slightly to give it a more realistic look. I was also careful to leave a tiny dot of white for the highlight in each eye. And even though I didn't paint the eyelashes in straight away, having that contrast there helped me to see that I needed to darken up other areas too, like the neck for example. It can be a bit of a balancing act where painting one area can affect how another area appears, but with patience and time, your painting will start to emerge and take shape. For the girl's hair, I thought I'd go a bit looser on the right hand side and just see what happens, so it was back to my size 10 brush again. I painted a dark brown for the darker underneath layer of hair by the neck and for the hair on the left hand side, and used burnt sienna for the brighter tones, softening them out with a clean damp brush. With all that dry and several more layers later, it was time to add in the finer details like the eyebrows and the eyelashes. I used a really small round brush for this, right on the tip, and carefully added individual hairs following the direction of hair growth. Then, with the eyes drying, I painted the top of the denim jacket using ultramarine blue. And added another darker layer on top. I really like painting different textures and fabric in watercolour, so let me know if that's something you would like to see me do in a future video on this channel. Now she's still looking a bit strange, so let's paint in her fringe and finish off her hair. The portrait is looking a lot better now, but I wanted to add a few finishing touches and a bit of texture with some colour pencils. I added some darker strands to the hair and then used the same two colours to add in those all-important freckles. This part was a lot of fun. I could have used my watercolours for the freckles, but I fancied using the pencils today, as it was quick and easy to change up the colours and vary the size of the freckles too. I added in some white highlights to her lips as well, and a few flyaway hairs. Then it was back to the lips again to add a bit more detail. They aren't exactly like the reference image, but finally it did feel like it was all coming together. And I was glad I pushed through to finish it. So, like I said in tip 5, it's important to be patient and do your best to finish what you started, even if you're not completely happy with the end result. You learn more by finishing it than by scrapping it. I think I could have emphasised the highlight on the cheek more, for example, but I still quite like how this softer version of the photo turned out. So that's all for today. I hope you found my top 5 tips helpful in some way and enjoyed the video. If you have any other tips for painting portraits in watercolour, then please do share them in the comments box below. I love hearing from you guys and really appreciate all your support, so thank you. Don't forget, if you like the video, to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you're not already. Hit the bell icon too to be notified as soon as I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, bye.